Hi, I'm Lynda Clark and I'm here to talk to you today about writing for talking machines. Let's start with Raj and Siri. Obviously, The Big Bang Theory is a comedy series, and so Raj's relationship with his phone's voice assistant Siri is there as a joke. But Raj's affection for Siri and the assumptions he makes based on his conversations with it exemplify the reality of many people's interactions with speaking machines. In a recent study by the universities of Waterloo and Lille, researchers found that actually the majority of people tend to assign personalities to virtual agents in this way. So there was some disagreement over what the agents look like. In the background of this slide, you can see there's some visualizations from the study based on people's descriptions of what they thought the agent's appearance would be. But personality traits arose with a degree of consistency. So Google Assistant was nerdy, Alexa was peculiar and bright, Siri was audacious and daring. And some participants even mentioned being a bit put out that the agents weren't sufficiently warm towards them, which again is very like Raj. And it's easy to laugh at Raj's interpretation of Siri's statements, but it's worth being aware of how common his behaviour is. We ascribe personality intent to these tools and we experience feelings of joy and fear because of them, and we're often unaware that these joys and fears actually originate in ourselves rather than in the technologies in question. This presentation considers how audience reactions to these early conversational machines, such as Euphonia and Eliza, might inform the narrative design of modern voice agents and AI conversational systems. This culminates with the lessons learned from writing Euphonia, which was a short, experimental, voice-controlled, AI-powered story, and it was inspired by the real-life machine and the popular narratives that surrounded it. So let's start by a trip back in time to meet some of these Siri's early ancestors. So in 1846, Joseph Faber presented his life's work at London's Egyptian Hall, and that was the fabulous talking machine Euphonia. At the time, it was presented as an automaton in traditional Turkish clothing. The image of it here in the centre is a later iteration. We unfortunately don't have that much information about Euphonia today beyond some contemporary accounts, but at the time it was famous enough that it was spoofed in political cartoons and it could draw a crowd whenever it was displayed at these various expos. The scientific community mostly admired Faber's achievement, so they recognised the difficulty in synthesising human voice in this way, but the general public reacted quite differently. Faber, although he didn't show the internal workings of the machine, did explain how it worked. So there was a piano keyboard that moved a series of bellows, pipes and reeds, and this was likely building on similar work by Wolfgang von Kempelen, who had also done voice synthesis work a little bit before Faber. But even though he'd explained that this was him moving piano keys, the public still saw a more supernatural explanation for the machine's voice. So according to a Chambers Journal reporter who was present, there was an old lady in the crowd who thought Euphonia was an oracle of some kind and asked it all manner of questions. And even the tone of the reporter's article, it anthropomorphizes Euphonia, and he comments on the machine's astonishing sagacity. Among some other rather salacious speculations, the theatre manager John Hangshead, who was also present, describes the machine's speech as hoarse and sepulchral, as if from the depths of a tomb. And as a bit of an aside, that's where my interest in Euphonia began, really. I have the incurable vocal disorder spasmodic dysphonia, sometimes also called laryngeal dystonia. And it means that, like Euphonia, my voice is what the Chambers reports called defective, apt to break, or imperfect. I'm often asked why I'm on the verge of tears because of my vocal disorder. And Hollingshead, true to his dramatic form, described Euphania as Faber's child of infinite labour and unmeasurable sorrow, and it's likely that that unmeasurable sorrow part is referring to its voice and the tone of it and how it sounded when it spoke. So the main similarity between modern voice agents and Euphonia is this tendency for people to ascribe personality with a reasonable amount of consistency. Hollingshead was quite extreme in what he said about Euphonia, but most of the other eyewitnesses had some combination of Euphonia being both eerie and intelligent. A similar effect occurred with an entirely different sort of conversation machine created by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT in the 1960s. This one was called Eliza, named for Eliza Doolittle. It didn't have any vocal capabilities, but unlike Euphonia, it was able to hold a conversation without input from its creator. So it was typed conversation, but it was all done automatically. So the example image here is a modern online mock-up where you can speak to it, and it attempts to recreate the experience of talking to Eliza, but with the addition of text-to-speech technology, so it's not how that machine actually would have worked originally. So like Faber, Weizenbaum was upfront about the nature of the machine, the fact that it recognises keywords and uses input and then repurposes them in its responses. But also, like with Faber's experiment, participants were really eager to believe that the machine understood what they were saying. And Weizenbaum suggested that this was in part due to the framing of Eliza as a psychotherapist. So they did this so that it set the expectation that any questions that were asked by the machine were being asked for a specific purpose, rather than the machine just parroting these inputs back to the participant that they'd put in earlier. And he refers to this aura of magic experienced by participants in their interactions with Eliza. So again, there's this kind of supernatural element in relation to a conversational machine. And this also brings us back to Raj and his conversation with Siri, where it's Raj's interpretation of the conversation that gives Siri personality rather than what it actually says. This pretty emphatically answers our first question, and it starts to answer the second. People have had this propensity for bestowing intelligence, personality, and intent on speaking machines since their inception. The newness of the technology certainly seems to have played a part in the reactions to Euphonia and Eliza, but we continue to make these assumptions in regard to modern conversational agents, even though pretty much everyone has one of them on their phones. I do apologise. So it may be that we can make some design ideas, and we can take some design ideas from these older technologies and apply them to their modern counterparts. In order to explore this more fully, I collaborated with my colleagues to revive Euphonia. What happened to both the machine and its creator are unknown. In his memoir, Hollingshead suggests that Faber destroyed himself and his figure, and this is often presented as fact and reported in other sources. But we know that Faber's nephew-in-law continued presenting the Euphonia, and he toured it with P.T. Barnum many years after the Egyptian Hall appearance. So the truth is, we don't know what happened to Faber Senior or the machine. And so that mystery seemed like an appropriate starting point for a conversational narrative game. We created two versions of Euphonia. They both used AI-powered authoring tools and both allow the user to converse with the machine. The story drew on the story of the real Euphonia and the fact that there's this strange supernatural mythologising around the machine. But some elements of the narrative arose from this earlier research about the way people react to these kind of machines and the way that they actually work. Versus the way they actually work, I should say. There's a concept in games writing which goes by various names, but I've heard it referred to as embracing the clunk or the narrative straitjacket. And what it basically boils down to is being aware of the technical limitations before you begin and building these into the narrative around what it is that you're doing. So this is what we saw with Weizenbaum, where he framed Eliza as a psychiatrist. And we don't know for sure that it's the reason that Faber changed the euphonia model from a male to a female model, but it's a possibility. So as I mentioned, it's likely that Faber based his work on Kemplen's earlier work, and in that work, Kemplen suggested that if he remade his machine, he would probably remake it as a child, because the highness of its voice meant that people would accept it more in the form of a child. So it could be that, again, that Faber kind of built on this idea and thought that a female frame would be more acceptable to people. So one of the reasons for choosing Euphonia as the character in this project is that I knew from my testing with the AI tools that there's a possibility that the AI could mismatch or mishear what the player had said. And so creating this persona of a slightly mad, dysfunctional, broken down old machine would help cover up some of those issues. This leads into the second principle, which we've seen through all of these examples. So the audience tend to imagine a greater degree of intelligence and personality behind a talking machine than actually exists. So we did this on a micro budget, and throughout kind of the team raised various issues, such as being concerned about using the default voice in Azure, or the fact that the model's mouth would only flap rather than syncing with the speech. And I was able to tell them with reasonable confidence that those things wouldn't matter because of that framing of it as being this kind of dysfunctional machine. Which isn't to say you shouldn't kind of care about elements of polish or design in that way, but if you thought about point 1, point 2 should help make up for the shortfall. There were some things that I only learned during the writing process. So keyword selection was a major one of those. I was really surprised by how little has changed since Eliza in terms of the way we kind of structure and use natural language in these tools. I foolishly believed the hype of the AI tool, the newer AI tools, that they could now use the context to distinguish what the player meant. And the reality is they still need a lot of help on the kind of coding and categorizing and writing side in order to do that. So one issue I had was a point where Euphonia asked for help, and if the player simply says yes, then everything functions correctly. But if the player says okay, I will help, or something along those lines, the system recognises the word help as a keyword and that the player is asking for help, and so it explains to them how to proceed, and then can get stuck in a loop of just trying to tell them what they need to do in order to play. So it's worth thinking not only about the keywords themselves, but also their synonyms and potential use cases, which is something I really wish I had done more before starting. Let me just move myself out of the way. You cannot plan and iterate enough with this kind of narrative. So obviously planning and iterating is essential to any kind of interactive narrative, but it's especially true here. So I planned out in Excel, I created a twine outline, I created a playable twine version, and then there were several speaking iterations, and there were still issues that either slipped through the net or were really difficult to fix, like the help keyword issue. So with natural language input, players can say absolutely anything, and they probably will, and it can be really hard to account for everything that they say and to test it thoroughly. What's up again? And finally, one of the most fun and rewarding and exciting things about writing for talking machines is precisely this kind of unpredictability. So when a user asks something you weren't expecting and the machine either responds appropriately or inappropriately, it's really fun, and it almost always teaches you something new about characterization or structuring conversations that you can take away to use for future projects, whether they're for talking machines or whether it's a non-digital text. Thank you for listening.